Okay, perfect. So I'm SJ. I'm the comms manager for Commission Shift, and I'm joined with our awesome speakers today. First, Paige Powell will give some slides on an overview of CCUS, and Jen Powis with Earthjustice is going to go into the regulatory gaps that exist right now with CCUS. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Paige, our policy manager, I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you so much. As I share my screen, please let me know. Looks like it's good. So I just want to go over this pretty quickly. I don't know what everybody here knows about CCUS, so I just wanted to give kind of a brief overview of where we are here in Texas. So Commission Shift has been around for about 2.5 years, and our mission is to transform oil and gas regulation by building public support to hold the Railroad Commission of Texas accountable to its mission in a shifting energy landscape. And we believe in global energy leadership, generational responsibility, inclusive decision-making, good government, and most importantly, the people of Texas. Today, we're going to go over just an overview of CCS, what each of the aspects are, and then kind of some specific issues around Class 2 and Class 6 storage. So CCUS stands for Carbon Capture, Use, and Storage, or Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Sequestration. Most folks don't make a distinction between storage and sequestration, although I do think that there is sort of a permanence aspect in the latter. And so it's just something to be mindful of as the conversations move forward and people talk about storage versus sequestration. This also, when we talk about carbon capture, that's really the carbon from carbon dioxide emissions, but it's also carbon that's captured in from methane and LNG when they make hydrogen and then ammonia. All of this sort of came through recently because of the IIJA and BIL IRA and the billions of dollars of federal funding headed to CCUS and hydrogen projects, which is really just a major expansion of the 45Q tax credit for CCUS that we've seen to be very fraudulent and have no oversight. So we think maybe it's a bit problematic. This is really just increasing taxpayer subsidies to the build out of a fossil industry waste disposal network. And unfortunately, the benefits of Justice 40 that are being touted for these projects are really just jobs that are really dangerous jobs, and it's going to be mostly construction, temporary jobs of permanent infrastructure that's going to have legacy effects for generations. A lot of proponents of CCUS like to say that they've been doing it for 50 years, so they know what they're doing, and that's true. EOR, carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, started in 1972, but it was never really intended to keep the CO2 sequestered long term. It was more of a, as the phrase, it would indicate for enhanced oil recovery, for getting more hydrocarbons out of wells that were essentially depleted and reaching those sort of last hard to get at bits. So what they're doing is injecting CO2, storing carbon emissions to produce more hydrocarbons, which are then going to be burned, releasing more emissions into the atmosphere. Right now, there are about 800 wells in the state of Texas that are permitted for CO2 disposal, some into productive zones and others into non-productive zones. And this map is from Frac Tracker's website, which just kind of shows where those storage locations are in the state. Currently, there are several projects in Texas for CO2 EOR. Terrell Natural Gas is the one that started in 72. It's been going for 50 years. And it's actually, the next one, Century Plant, which only started in 2010, is the largest in the world. It stores 8.4 megatons of CO2 every year. And all of these projects, as we said, are really just for EOR, for enhanced oil recovery. None of them are storing carbon long-term. There's one in Port Arthur where they do steam methane reformation, turning methane into hydrogen. And then Petra Nova, hopefully y'all are familiar with that. It's a retrofit of a coal-fired power plant southwest of Houston. There's also a net power demonstration plant in the Houston Ship Channel. And this is an oxy-fuel sort of energy generation facility that inherently captures the CO2 from emissions. And Oxy is hoping to use this technology at their direct air capture facility in West Texas. Although there was recently an announcement earlier this week that the Net Power project is not going to be online within the time frame expected, and could delay implementation of Net Power for Oxy's use in the Permian by up to 2 years. Oxy also has other projects, this white energy ethanol facility. There's one in Lake Charles, where in Louisiana, where the CO2 captured is piped across the state line for EOR here in Texas. And then, of course, the Oxy's Permian facility that's already sort of broken ground and being built as we speak. So this map is from the Rice University Baker Institute, and it shows kind of the projected build out. Well, it shows the current assets in the state, right? The brown area shows where current oil and gas is being developed. The light blue area shows saline formations, either aquifers or salt caverns, where CO2 can be injected. And the purple are sources of CO2, current emitters. The little purple lines, of course, are the pipeline, and you can see there's a lot going on in West Texas, and then here along the Gulf Coast. And it's projected that because of our geology and the co-location with industry emitters, that there's going to be a lot of CO2 built out, or CO2 storage built out in the near future. This is a map from Princeton's Net Zero America report, which shows the proposed pipeline build out up to 2050. And I think it's really interesting to note that the blue sort of trunk lines, as they're called, are really 2 or 3 tandem 48-inch pipelines. Because of the volume of CO2 that has to travel, they're having to put multiple pipelines next to one another in the same sort of right of way. And unfortunately, there was a JP Morgan analysis of this forecast that showed that even with all of this infrastructure build out, all the facilities and the network of pipelines, this is only going to capture 15% of the current US greenhouse gas emissions. So this is not a silver bullet. It's not going to save us and capture all of our emissions. It's really only a fraction of the problem. So class 6 wells are a new type of well being permitted by the Environmental Protection Agency. And their primary jurisdiction is to protect underground sources of drinking water. They also have a bit of authority in providing environmental justice guidance around what these wells would look like and what that means for communities. But unfortunately, their EJ office and the EJ guidance are not rules, and therefore it really has no teeth. And I think maybe Jen might talk a little bit more about that. But the EPA is permitting class 6 wells on a case-by-case basis, and it's taking a really long time. So they're offering states the ability to have primacy or primary permitting authority over class 6 wells. They're hoping to give primacy to Texas. Louisiana is probably going to be first, Texas after that, so that these permits can be rolled out in a faster, shorter timeline. PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is a subset of the Department of Transportation, regulates CO2 pipeline safety, and they're currently undertaking new rules, which will hopefully be proposed and promulgated in the next year or so. But currently, there are no comprehensive CO2 pipeline safety rules that cover all phases of CO2, from gas to liquid to supercritical. Of course, the IRS is involved here, given that the 45Q tax credits go through them. And we know that there is no carbon accounting framework for monitoring, verification, and reporting. And so we're seeing a lot of fraud in that program. And then offshore, the Railroad Commission has jurisdiction over the general land office leases, which are state-owned lands that have been leased to companies for CO2 injection in wetlands. Oh no, did I lose my screen? I did. Looks like I clicked on the GLO thing. How do I go back? Boy, that really stopped my flow, didn't it? All right, I'm gonna go back. Let's see if I can do this again. Okay. I'm gonna go back one. So I think okay. And then also the Department of the Interior, which is a federal agency, has jurisdiction over outer continental shelf sequestration. So both of these are offshore lands, which are within 10 miles of the Texas coast. And we're going to be seeing more either both class 2 and class 6 injection in these areas. So the planned projects, like we said, are not just for CO2 storage, but they include hydrogen facilities, ammonia, methanol, ethanol, liquefied natural gas, and biofuel facilities. All of these have the potential to capture carbon at the source of production, transport it, and store it underground. And the Department of Energy is really excited about all of these projects. They've awarded funding to direct air capture hubs in Kingsville, Texas, and Lake Charles, Louisiana. They're providing grants to fund the CO2 pipeline network build out. They're even funding workforce development for industrial retrofit projects, maybe converting old LNG pipelines to CO2 pipelines, which we've heard is pretty dangerous. And then also for the hydrogen hubs, recently the Gulf Coast Hydrogen Hub here in Texas was awarded $1.2 billion for this build out. And they're proposing an 80% blue hydrogen, which is made from methane, and 20% green hydrogen from electrolysis. So this is still just a perpetuation of fossil fuels, not necessarily a clean energy transition. This is a list of some of the projects that we're seeing coming to Texas. This is only 39 of them. I think there may be more as they kind of keep coming online, but you can see they're kind of all over the state. Everyone's involved, from Calpine to Lind to Oxy and on and on. So we're seeing things like coal-fired power plants, LNG, hydrogen, capturing at the source, and then there's direct air capture, which a lot of proponents say are going to address legacy emissions, but industry is saying it's going to sort of ensure their social license to operate into the next century and really promote the extend the lifeline of fossil fuels for the next 60 or 70 years. Some examples, we see the Petronova facility southwest of Houston, which hasn't met its emissions targets. It was mothballed after just 3 years because the price of oil went down, and so it wasn't generating as much revenue as projected. And they did recently restart operations just a couple of months ago, but unfortunately, they're only capturing emissions from one stack of I think there's 4 different stacks, so it's capturing less than 25% of the emissions from the entire facility. And then that 25%, that one stack, is not hitting the 90% emissions capture that they had projected. Similarly, the Gorgon facility in Australia, we're seeing that it's not capturing the rates that it proposed because it's offline due to sand in the machinery. There's also problems with wastewater injection. As they're going to inject this CO2, they're seeing microseismic events, which is indicating that there may be earthquakes if they continue to inject. And so they're having to pump out wastewater from these wells and dispose of that wastewater somewhere else in order to prevent earthquakes. And so you can see that there are sort of like a slew of problems associated with this. There's also been worker strikes for better conditions. And this is actually located in a nature reserve. So I think the Australian government recently sort of gave a temporary hiatus and revoked their permit because of all of the problems associated with this project. Up in Iceland is touted as one of the world's premier direct air capture facilities. But again, we're seeing storage problems because the subsurface is shifting in ways that they didn't foresee, and there is much reduced capacity. They were projecting whatever number, and there's only a fraction of that because the pores are filling up in a different way than anticipated. They're not able to store as much carbon as intended. And the capture rates are impacted by harsh weather, frozen machinery, and really this technology is so expensive, consumes so much energy that critics say it's not going to be able to operate at a meaningful scale. So CCUS essentially is going to mean more dangerous infrastructure in already overburdened communities. And the benefits being touted for these projects are dangerous jobs based on risky failing technology. In transport, CO2 ruptures, pipeline ruptures can kill. CO2 is an asphyxiant and it's heavier than air. So when there's a rupture, that CO2 pipeline, that CO2 cloud sort of follows the path of least resistance down to low-lying areas, oftentimes where towns are. We saw this in Satartia, Mississippi a few years ago when there was a rupture of the Denbury pipeline there, which sent 50 people to the hospital, some of whom are still having neurological impacts from that exposure. And we do know that natural gas pipeline leaks and explosions are common in this area, particularly as climate makes more extreme, climate changes induce more extreme weather events. We're seeing sort of drought conditions, which will crack the land, flooding, rain events, which are going to create mud and mudslides, which is what happened in Satartia. So having really rigid infrastructure on, flexible, movable land in the time of sort of like weather and climate uncertainty is a problem just waiting to happen. Here's an image of what happened in Satartia. If you're not familiar with this event, please do go and search for it. There are some pretty frightening recordings of the 911 calls to emergency responders from folks who didn't know what was going on. And as an asphyxiant, CO2 not only takes air away from people, but also automobiles, which use combustion engines, so cars can't drive into areas that are affected by CO2 plume. Furthermore, pipelines get eminent domain. So if you own some land or even pore space under one of these projects, your land can be incorporated against your will, against the owner's will, for the development of CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. We were seeing some legislation about this at the Texas session this last spring, and there's probably going to be more coming up in 2025. In the Midwest, we're seeing a really strong pushback against these pipelines, and there were several permits that were actually revoked. I believe it was from Navigator as the pipeline company, because there was such a strong community pushback. And so there's an opportunity for folks here in the Gulf Coast to organize against these, if we don't want to see more pipelines in our neighborhoods. There's a lot of problems with enhanced soil recovery. The injection of CO2 causes increased pressure in the subsurface. And so we're seeing, like we said, induced seismicity, more earthquakes, and other unfavorable outcomes. Some of those include unplugged well leaks and blowouts, like the Crane County geyser, which was actually an undocumented well that nobody knew about until it started spraying noxious fluids. We're also seeing sinkholes. This is a picture of the one in Daysetta, Texas, just northeast of Houston, which recently began expanding again in April after more than 15 years of being dormant. And this is nearby a number of Class 2 injection wells, which were for brine mining and extraction. And so these are a product of a salt dome collapse. And it's just kind of goes to show that, you know, operators and geologists don't always know what's going on in the subsurface, and even sort of projected models can be incorrect. And, you know, geology can kind of do its own thing, you know, outside of the sort of bounds of the modeling. We're seeing salt dome collapse and more sinkholes in Southwest Louisiana, Southeast Texas. So this entire area, this saline formation, which is supposedly very secure and good for storage, is being compromised due to moisture dissolving those structural solids. So what else could go wrong? In addition to earthquakes and blowouts, which can cause groundwater contamination, we can see the CO2 plume underground migrate into underground sources of drinking water and aquifers. And when CO2 meets H2O, it causes carbonic acid, which is highly corrosive to steel, which can dissolve drills and also well casings. So if there's a well cased in steel and cement, and the CO2 carbonic acid plume meets it, can dissolve that steel and corrode it, and provide an avenue for the CO2 to escape. There are also ecosystem impacts as the CO2 migrates up through pores in the soil and asphyxiates the organisms living there. And again, when the CO2 is released into the atmosphere through different faults or other avenues of escape, it's basically reversing any climate benefit of storing the CO2 in the first place. So this is just a diagram of the types of trapping mechanisms available to CO2. And as you can see on this logarithmic time scale, that the majority of the trapping is structural, meaning that it has to be actively contained until at least about 100 years, when the residual and dissolution trapping mechanisms take over. And so we're really advocating for long-term monitoring of 100 years, active, you know, engagement and liability, responsibility to say, if and when this CO2 is released, you know, who's responsible for making it right. We want to see perpetual, evergreen monitoring and enforcement. And we want to see a CO2 trust fund at the state that's sufficient to cover all of the aspects of this program for 50 to 100, maybe even 1,000 years, right? The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, says that 99% of the CO2 needs to remain stored for 1,000 years in order to really be impactful to the climate. And so if we don't have a state regulatory agency that's ensuring the carbon is staying sequestered for that amount of time, we're not doing a service to the climate. The question is, who's going to be liable for this? Is it the private companies that are drilling and injecting the CO2, or is it going to be the state and the people of Texas left to foot the bill? So finally, CCS, you know, is only really economically viable through taxpayer-funded subsidies to the industry. We're seeing that before these subsidies came into place, companies were having a hard time getting loans for these projects because they're so risky and there was so much liability. And so these public investments into the projects are essentially distorting the market safety mechanisms inherent in the process, which is causing more risk for all of the people here in Texas and the United States. And again, I'm just going to say that there is no uniform and consistent carbon accounting methodology from the federal government. And until that framework is established, there's no assurance that the carbon emissions are staying stored long term. And there's a really rampant opportunity for tax fraud. So, you know, if the RRC is mismanaging its current liabilities and old wells that are not being plugged and injection wells that are blowing out, what's going to happen to the carbon storage wells of the future? And that brings us to Class 6 primacy. There are a lot of groups across the country that are fighting primacy, that are fighting CO2 including in Louisiana, in the Midwest, and here in Texas. And we would love to invite you to join us in telling the EPA that the Railroad Commission should not have primacy over Class 6 injection wells. And with that, I'd like to introduce Jen Powis. I think she's going to give us a little bit more about the regulatory frameworks and liability issues for these. Jen is the managing attorney for Earthjustice Gulf Coast office. And I'm so happy she's here with us today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Take it away, Jen.
Paige, thank you so much. And both to SJ and Paige and to the rest of the staff at Commission Shift, I just want to say a quick thank you for inviting me today to talk a little bit more about the regulatory framework around really this administration's moonshot approach to carbon management. And I think what you'll see through the presentation is that while there's a lot of dollars behind this initiative, there's not a lot of accountability. And that's really the problem from the regulatory and legal side that Commission Shift wanted me to talk a little bit about. I also just wanted to lift up, we're a small group here. So if y'all want to come on screen and ask questions, I think Paige and I would both invite you to do so. These presentations that Commission Shift is rolling out over the next few months are really meant to inform and engage community members in this topic, in part because so much of these projects are aimed at the Texas Gulf Coast, also in Louisiana, and Paige mentioned that a little bit as well. But really, a lot of that money is coming this way. And as community members and those concerned about the environment in general, understanding this attempt at addressing climate change is going to be incredibly important for our community. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So again, my name is Jen Powis. I'm the managing attorney for the Gulf Regional Office, which is Earthjustice's 15th regional place-based office. We've been open down here for about 1.5 years, but Earthjustice has been working in the region for almost its entire 50 years in existence. When I first opened the office, we had 75 plus litigation matters already touching the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. We have a separate office in Florida. And so Earthjustice's work down here is ongoing. We're the largest nonprofit public interest law firm. And I think what's most important about the work that we do is that we represent our community groups and activists and advocates for free, both in direct litigation, but also in a lot of the administrative advocacy pieces. And you'll see some of that today. So why Texas and why now? And I think for those of us that live down here, we sort of inherently know that answer. It's because any attempt at addressing climate change is going to have to rein in Texas's carbon emissions. So based on EIA's data from 2020, the Lone Star State leads the country in million metric tons of carbon dioxide pollution. And what this chart demonstrates is really the breakdown by industry. Because Texas's 624 million metric tons is more than double that of California's. And really, California has already addressed a lot of its industrial pollution. Most of its carbon emissions are actually coming from the transportation sector. And so while we're really not talking about carbon management in total today, we're really focused on CCS and CCUS. It's really important, I think, for community groups to understand that all of these different pieces are at play when we talk about addressing climate change for our country, both from the carbon capture and storage perspective or reining in industrial emissions, along with reining in emissions from transportation and other sectors, including the power sector. It's also, I think, really important to understand the magnitude of the problem. So forecasts across the board demonstrate the difficulty in getting our carbon pollution problem under control. Regardless of whether or not you believe that carbon capture and the dollars coming into carbon capture are a good idea by this administration. The reality is that that money is there. And even if they're able to capture at the rate that they articulate, industry articulates that they're going to be able to capture at, we're really not looking at substantial reductions to meet a lot of our goals long term. The problem that Paige and SJ asked me to talk about, though, was really in looking at what industry is touting as its ability to capture carbon and what the reality is under the regulatory framework now. In other words, there's no accountability baked into the system. So when you hear industry talking about capturing carbon at the 90 or 95% rates for whatever stacks they might be talking about, you don't see that requirement being listed out in permits or rulemakings from EPA or other places. And without that accountability, even with these best forecasts that we're looking at, there's going to be this substantial gap. And so to me, that's the opportunity that the legal side, Earthjustice side, has to bring to the table when we're talking about carbon management. So when we look at Texas, right, and Texas is leading in carbon pollution, why Houston? What's so important about the Houston region? And again, I think for those of us that are in Texas, we recognize that Houston leads the nation in air pollution, and that carbon is really a co-pollutant with so many other pollutants. So when we're thinking about this work, however you want to frame your work, to me, this is the same work we've always done as an environmental movement, whether it be carbon or some of these more dangerous individual pollutants, HAPs, hazardous air pollutants, etc. This idea that industry has a blank check to continue to pollute our air is the main problem. And so by officing in Houston, Texas, the hope is that we can do both addressing climate change through some sort of carbon capture advocacy, but also really addressing overall air quality in our region. Paige mentioned it a little bit, and I think it's just incredibly important to lift up how environmental justice is really at the root of our problems with industry. This idea that industrial siting aligns with segregationist land use policies from the past can be mapped, and it can be mapped here in Houston. Many of you locally have seen this map from a number of years ago. And this idea that where we've placed facilities is often putting communities of color at the most risk for air pollution. And then it's compounded by this idea that carbon pollution is enhancing climate change. And then we're seeing stronger storms, et cetera. It's all related. And so from my viewpoint, it's often this idea that combating justice and sort of standing for social justice can really address some of these overarching environmental problems that we're seeing, including climate change.
And can you make sure the slides are selected that you're sharing? I think we're still seeing that first slide of the presentation as the main one.
I'm so sorry. It's showing on my side that it's walking through. Can you see that now?
Sorry about that. No, it's still the first one.
Oh, hold on, y'all. I'm so sorry. We had this problem during our check too. Are you seeing the slides now? But just in PowerPoint view. So y'all, I apologize for that, but we're going to continue on this way because I'm not sure why we're having this issue. But I want to kind of go back up really quickly because to me, this was the one that I most wanted you all to be able to see, which is really highlighting the Lone Star State's carbon emissions and the breakdown by type of carbon as compared to the other states. And so I'm not going to repeat everything that I've been talking about, But luckily, this is being recorded, and I think SJ will be able to provide the PowerPoints after this in case you all are interested. So let me kind of walk through some of these. And so I was talking about how environmental justice highlights the way we've placed industrial sites from land segregationist use policies in the past. And that's true for both for Houston as well as Louisiana. And I think what often doesn't get lifted up in the narrative around some of these issues is how industrial sites sort of mirror even plantations from the past in Louisiana. And so again, we're talking here predominantly about carbon capture, but the reason we wanted to lay this groundwork of environmental justice is because of like what Paige had been identifying, that the carbon capture sequestration dollars are really not justice $40. This idea that these additional subsidies to industry to utilize technology that has been in use since the 60s and 70s to address climate change, to address environmental justice, to address air pollution in general, both in our region and abroad, it just doesn't hold up. Not only because the regulatory framework's not there, but because this idea that these facilities are all sited in communities that are really overburdened, and that not only does the carbon capture piece have no accountability within the rules, but we're still working through litigation and advocacy to the EPA and otherwise to address cumulative impacts from all of the pollutants, not just carbon, but some of those other air pollutants that were on some of the previous slides. So sort of backing up again, and Paige did such a fabulous job laying the table for this, but carbon capture is not new. So carbon capture and use have really been known under different letters as EOR, enhanced oil recovery. And the industry, particularly in Texas, has been utilizing EOR to frack rocks to get more gas, more oil out of the geology for decades. What is new is this idea that they want to permanently store that carbon. And yet again, from the regulatory framework, instead of this permanent storage being required under the rules, industries permitted to utilize some of the subsidies for carbon capture, use, and storage, and still then use that carbon to do enhanced oil recovery. And again, Paige covered this in her presentation as well. The failures around carbon capture, Paige's slides, I think, told it all. And so I really appreciate her sort of starting with just the facts of what we've seen throughout the nation. But I wanted to lift up Petra Nova again because Petra Nova has just restarted. The carbon capture equipment is on one stack for the largest coal plant remaining in Texas. It was turned off in part because the economics don't work. And that, I think, really tells the story of what carbon capture and subsidies have been trying to do, right? Those subsidies make it so that industry can turn those pieces of equipment back on. But if they're not meeting the requirements of actually keeping that carbon, storing that carbon, capturing that carbon, then that subsidy is not actually addressing climate change. And that's, I think, the main concern that communities have, and sort of the work that Earthjustice is leading on when we submit comments to EPA or to Treasury or to all of these other regulatory agencies that are trying to address or create this framework for carbon management. So again, as Paige identified, just the subsidies around CCS and CCUS is not a Justice 40 solution, in part because the regulatory framework's not there to force industry to keep carbon permanently sequestered and or to address the actual capture rates around how much carbon they're emitting into the air. And so first, let's take the power sector. The current EPA is looking at new rulemaking around Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, which would require new technologies or best available technologies to meet carbon emissions. It does not mandate carbon capture, but that's one way that a facility could get there. But I really wanted to talk a minute about West Virginia versus EPA to sort of show how we got to this place. And so many of you may remember from 2015, President Obama's Clean Power Plan that really looked at transitioning our electricity sector away from fossil fuel generation, in part because the EPA had thought that was the best way to reduce carbon emissions. It was met with immediate litigation and challenges. And in 2016, the Clean Power Plan was stalled out. A few years later, under the Trump administration, Trump pulled back the Clean Power Plan and instead put forth the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which was also immediately met with litigation. And so that further stalled it out. And then in 2022, litigation made its way up to the Supreme Court that was really just looking at this issue in total. What is EPA's authority to deal with carbon? How can carbon as a pollutant be managed through litigation or otherwise through the regulatory rulemaking process? And what we saw was that the Supreme Court doubled down on this idea of a judicially made doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine. And through that doctrine, the courts said that the agency really had limited authority or ability to regulate something of such importance as climate change. And I lift up this case in particular because I think it demonstrates the struggle that the country is having with how to address climate change, and also the limitations that we see with the legal underpinnings for carbon management that this administration is now trying to deal with. From the West Virginia versus EPA case, that's where you saw EPA pull back its rulemakings then. So now under the Biden administration, putting forth a new plan under Section 111, looking again at how can power plants rein in carbon, but really from a pollutant standpoint. What can they do in order to address carbon? And that rulemaking is ongoing. Paige talked a little bit about the 45Q issues, which were expanded again underneath the IRA, increasing the subsidy that industry would receive if they would agree to adopt carbon capture technology in some way. And so if they were to actually sequester it, they went from $50 per ton of carbon to $85. Right, and sequester, as Paige so aptly described, right, is to actually store it under the ground. But they were also provided a subsidy if they pulled carbon and used it for enhanced oil recovery, right? So they're being subsidized to get more oil and gas out of the ground as part of a program that ostensibly has been identified as our moonshot, right, to address carbon. And so again, this framework, this regulatory framework is missing from lots of different places in order to hold industry accountable for what it is emitting if carbon is a pollutant. And while Earthjustice, again, is leading the charge on lots of these different pieces, or attempting to lead the charge, and engaging in deep partnership with communities across the country in a lot of these rulemakings and with EPA, et cetera. If we can't hold industry accountable to addressing this pollutant, and we're not successful in really baking these accountability metrics in, then these subsidies just are just that. They're just subsidies. And here you can see even under the IRA, the subsidy for carbon capture was then to enhance our ability to produce more fossil fuels, which to me, that's sort of the nutshell on why SJ and Paige asked me to come address some of these outstanding issues. So you might be asking, so like, where is 45Q even at, right? Well, it's at Treasury. And it's literally an accounting piece, right? And so if you think about the IRS or the Treasury Department, they're not really the agency that specializes in creating accountability around carbon. And yet they're doing the rulemaking on what should be required for industry to receive this subsidy. And Paige talked a little bit about the mismanagement of this program in years past. If you are not familiar with that story, just Google this, because in the past, industry was able to pull that subsidy down. And as I think we've been repeatedly saying, not meet the metrics that were identified with how much carbon they were supposed to capture out of their stacks. So for example, if it says they're supposed to capture 75% of the carbon coming out, they would pull that subsidy down and then not hit that metric. And there was no way to hold them accountable to that metric. And yet they still got the dollars from you and me and all the rest of the taxpayers across the country. So in part, what Earthjustice and many other groups that we work with across the nation have said to Treasury is, in order to receive that subsidy, right, somehow industry has to show that the carbon that they're capturing is real, that it's measurable, that they can, identify the percent that's coming out of the stack, and that it's permanently stored in some way. Paige on Commission's Shift, I think, are really the leading Texas-based organization working on CO2 pipelines and Class 2 wells in Texas. If you're familiar with their work at all, which many of you must be since you're on this Zoom call, the Class 2 problem, I think, is unique for Texas because we have really pioneered this idea of using CO2 in fracking to produce more oil and gas out of the subsurface. And this map is a little bit simpler than the maps that Paige showed, but really identifies where Class 2 wells and CO2 pipelines have predominantly been located in the state, and it's based on where the oil and gas is. And so you can see how, again, this idea that carbon capture use and storage is going to be in those same locations, most likely, but those same locations are consistently having problems, as many of Paige's slides showed, with the various blowouts in West Texas and in the Permian. While Texas might be sort of the leader in that, I think it'd be remiss to not talk about the Ohio River Valley and really Earthjustice's work there as well, where we saw some of those same Class 2 wells impacting drinking water. And as Paige mentioned, the Class 2 underground injection control well program really is aimed at protecting drinking water. So that's the whole regulatory framework. Again, can we protect the drinking water from whatever substances we're going to push underground for long-term storage, and what does that actually do? So not only are we seeing that problem here in Texas, but we're seeing it elsewhere, and Ohio is a great example of that. Right now, again, it's slightly repetitive, but as Paige mentioned, Class 6 wells would be a new type of underground injection control well. So this new program would only be aimed at carbon capture and sequestration wells. Right now, because it's a new program, the only permit authority that has the ability to issue a permit is EPA. But EPA has opened that up to states to seek primacy. And by seeking primacy, the state has to promise to meet the floor of the requirements to protect drinking water. And what you'll see from Paige and SJ, I think, at the end of this, is that because of Texas's failures and inability to run the Class 2 program, for carbon waste disposal or oil and gas waste disposal. Commission Shift and many of its partners don't want Texas to have the ability to run the Class 6 program when so much is unknown around carbon capture and sequestration. Pipeline safety, again, as Paige mentioned, I'm just looking at the time really quick, and we'll rush through these next two so that we can open it up for questions. But the regulatory framework around pipeline safety for carbon is non-existent, in part because the nation just has not ever really envisioned the amount of build out of pipelines for carbon capture sequestration. Like that slide that you saw that Paige had, it's an astronomical amount of pipeline that is envisioned to meet the goals and around capturing carbon. And yet we don't have in place the thickness of the steel, what type of requirements for the subsurface. How do you ensure that you don't have sort of those lines moving up and down, as Paige said, with when land gets flooded, etc. And so that too is some of the work that Earthjustice does from an advocacy perspective to the agency, federal agency called PHMSA on that. Finally, I asked Paige and SJ if I could just add a couple of slides on hydrogen, in part because carbon capture, sequestration, and use, I think, is related to the additional dollars that the Biden administration is pushing out towards hydrogen. And that's in part because all of these facilities really are utilizing these subsidies in different ways to see a major expansion of the petrochemical industry throughout the South. And those subsidies, while they are geared towards research and development dollars for carbon capture or hydrogen in this case, again, we're not seeing that regulatory framework to require actual substantive limits in order to meet sort of the environmental goals or the climate goals that the administration has otherwise articulated. So just a little bit about hydrogen, since Houston did receive about 1.2 billion with the high velocity hub. First, there's lots of different kinds of hydrogen. They talk about it as a rainbow of hydrogen. It depends how you're creating the hydrogen. So green hydrogen would be made using 100% new or surplus renewable energy, versus blue hydrogen, right, is where you have fossil gas making hydrogen, right? So again, you're utilizing fossil fuels, but you're placing that carbon capture and sequestration on that facility in order to make the hydrogen. That's what makes it blue. So I thought it was important to address that, because the hydrogen hub here articulates that 80% of it would probably be blue hydrogen, which means, again, a huge expansion of this carbon capture and sequestration technology. Should the facility actually have to meet its goals of capturing, 75 to 90% of that carbon. But again, we're not seeing that be in the air permits. We're not seeing it be in the regulations that it's a requirement in order to maintain that subsidy. And that's, again, the real problem. So just a little bit more about the hydrogen hubs, right? So obviously hydrogen has the potential to be less of a polluting form of industry. But if it's blue hydrogen and you're still using fossil, again, it's like with that 45Q subsidy. If you're receiving the subsidy and you're allowed to do enhanced oil recovery with it, you're still creating more carbon than what you're saving, because they're utilizing the fossil fuel industry in this way. And so there's additional known bads for that type of hydrogen. And unfortunately, we have the same issues around hydrogen from a safety perspective, from an accountability perspective, from a regulatory perspective that we have on the carbon side. It's really a lack of a framework, because, again, I think climate change is such an important issue for the country, and that it's really all new for how we're going to have to address it and deal with it. And with that, I wanted to lift up SJ's petition. And I will turn it over to SJ for this last slide and then pull down the slides and open it up for questions. And again, I'm sorry we had this issue with my slideshow. We couldn't get it working during our sound check either, so I'm not sure what happened then. But SJ?
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you for that presentation, Jen, of all that information. And I'm sure we can make these slides available for folks after the meeting as well. I'm going to drop the link to that primacy petition in the chat. This is one of the best shots we have of opposing the Railroad Commission of Texas's pursuit of primacy. They want, as I think both presenters explained, if our main oversight agency in Texas gets control over permitting Class 6 carbon injection wells, they don't have a good track record of managing the current injection wells. And so this petition is a way to get the attention of some of our EPA officials to build the pressure that this is not a good solution for Texas or our drinking water. So please take a look at it. There's the message that you can read. And we do encourage folks to take a moment to sign on after they take a look at that petition language. Other than that, I'm glad we have time for questions. We're a small group, so we can keep it pretty informal. If folks want to come off mute, please feel free. You can also use the chat and we'll be watching there for questions as well. But that is a lot of information. So we're hoping that people, have anything that they want to discuss, we can kind of get into and take the time. So thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.